on the all of us have been fixated on the Russian war on Ukraine, but there's a lot of interesting research going on about other aspects of the country, including its democratic development. And it's our great pleasure to welcome Dr. Ivan Gomza, academic director of the Public Policy and Governance Program at the Kyiv School of Economics. He joins us from Kyiv today. He received his PhD in political science from the joint Franco-Ukrainian program at the University of Paris 10 Nanterre and the Kyiv Mohyla Academy. Dr. Gomza was also a fellow of the German Academic Exchange Service and the Fulbright Faculty Development Program. His academic interests include democratization, authoritarian regimes, nationalism, contentious politics, and good governance. He is the author of 2 books, including one about France, and several articles on Ukrainian nationalism, authoritarian politics, and social movements for a wide range of prestigious journals. And he teaches both at the Kyiv School of Economics and the Kyiv Mohyla Academy. So Dr. Gomza, we'll turn to you, and we invite participants to submit questions in the chat as they come up. And so first, Dr. Gomza will give his presentation, and then we will turn to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Vishnik, for this gracious presentation. And I think we should go directly to the jugular and start discussing, I think, quite an interesting topic. So, as you might recall, throughout 2021, people worldwide organized mass rallies to challenge mandatory mask wearing and access to public places tied to anti-COVID vaccination. And the pandemic, it galvanized the vaccine hesitancy community, providing it with new frames and new followers, because even people who had positive attitudes towards traditional vaccines, they questioned hastily created serums and governmental rulings which imposed those serums, those vaccines. However, in Ukraine, vaccine hesitancy activism had some additional twist. Let me give you some details. In fall 2021, the security service of Ukraine stopped Stakhov. He was charged with conspiracy to organize a coup d'etat. Although Stakhov was eventually released on bail, the trajectory of Kyrylo Stremousov lends credence to coup plotting charges. A member of the anti-vaccination movement in Kherson, in 2022, Stremousov collaborated with Russian authorities, serving as deputy head of the Kherson military civilian administration. So all in all, it looks like vaccine hesitant actors do pose a threat to democratic constitutional order. In 2021, I was a guest to observe ever more stringent discussions between proponents and opponents of COVID vaccination. Clearly, societal polarization was afoot. Moreover, as vaccine-hesitant citizens contested quarantine measures resorting to contentious politics, I wondered whether the newly emerged fault line could have political repercussions. In other words, could the vaccine hesitancy movement morph into a political movement? And if positive, does it pose a danger to the fledgling democracy in Ukraine? On a more theoretical level, I wanted to test a principal hypothesis. Given the anti-establishment momentum displayed by vaccine skeptics, I expected them to espouse populist beliefs. By February 2022, I was collecting data via a specially designed online questionnaire. I was observing anti-vaccination mass rallies, and I was conducting in-depth interviews with members of the community in question. Then Russia invaded Ukraine, and almost overnight, it became callous to annoy people with questions about their political opinions and vaccination preferences. A heated discussion regarding COVID, so prominent in Ukraine prior to the invasion, it faded. It looked like my research became irrelevant. Still, I had the data on my laptop, which I had taken when fleeing Kyiv, and then developments with Stremousov and the like, they suddenly suggested that the irrelevance of the research might be exaggerated. So I went through the collected responses, reread the interviews, and tried to salvage whatever insights they might give. And today, I want to present some findings to you. We should start with the theoretical assumptions of my study. As scholarly literature suggests, the vaccine debate creates several types of attitudes. First, there are pro-vaccine people who believe in the effectiveness of vaccination. On the other side of the spectrum are the anti-vaccine individuals who avoid vaccinations for all costs. Finally, vaccine-hesitant people, they espouse an idiosyncratic view, rejecting some vaccines but accepting others, or not following the recommended schedule. The wave of COVID-19 was undoubtedly very helpful, let's put it that way, in expanding the vaccine-hesitant cohort because many people were unsure whether the newly introduced vaccines could be relied upon. Another vital distinction I need to emphasize is the gap between belief and behavior proper to any social situation. Concerning the topic in question, the gap elucidates why vaccine hesitancy rate is higher than that of unvaccinated people. The point is, people often doubt that vaccines are safe, effective, and appropriate to the extent the representatives of the medical establishment claim, but however, they still get vaccinated because of societal pressures or constraints. The gap between belief and behavior is responsible for an apparent paradox, for instance, in France, where 1 in 3 residents questions the safety of vaccines, but the vaccine coverage is close to 100%. The critical question I tackled was, could vaccine-hesitant beliefs be provoked or enhanced by a set of political views? Among different political ideologies, populism seemed to be especially suspicious. Unfortunately, the notion of populism, although ubiquitous in social science, remains challenging to conceptualize. And for the purpose of the study, I distinguish at least 4 different approaches to tackle the task. I mean, 4 different approaches which tried or are trying to conceptualize what populism is. The first is the economic approach, which views populism as a policy of excessive public expenditures on welfare, or at least promises of such overspending advanced by politicians who are intent on bolstering their electoral attractiveness. The second, or strategic approach, considers populism as a tactic resorted to by political outsiders. That is, people or politicians who don't have many good political connections, who come into politics from media, from fashion, from sport, and they are eager to compensate for their lack of political resources through declarative self-identification with the needs of the people. The third approach interprets populism as a thin ideology. As such, populism contends that in any political community, there are good people who should be sovereign and immoral elites imposing policies detrimental to the common good by trickery and coercion. And besides, populism rejects the principle of pluralism, considering the people as a homogeneous source of all good, whereas various minorities or splinter groups, they are natural allies of the immoral elites. And finally, the fourth approach conceptualizes populism as a performative action intent on expressing the true essence of things, regardless of conventions and rules. This so-called socio-cultural interpretation points to the requests of citizens that through their wording, their clothes, and expressed values, politicians should represent the true nature of things concealed by etiquette, political correctness, or international norms. Now, as you can see on the slide, there are several, 2 approaches are in red and 2 other are in green. Why? Because I think that the approaches in red focus on what I dub the supply end of the equation. They focus on tactics used by politicians whom we then label populist. Instead, the approaches in green, they constitute the demand end because they focus on societal sentiments that fuel populist politicians' assent. In other words, populist societal expectations provide some actors with opportunities to capitalize on, just as demand for food and housing lays the foundations for prosperous business entrepreneurs eager to notice and act upon those needs. Finally, elaborating the working definition of populism, I was guided by the observation by Pierre Rosanvallon that individuals are unable to comprehend the intrinsic complexity of contemporary civilization, and thus we all have to resort to simplification when trying to make sense of what is going on in politics, economics, and culture. And I suggest that when simplified schemata refer to detrimental influences of elites, minorities, or transnational actors, this indicates the activation of a populist interpretive frame. The more often people or actors use such a frame to comprehend social situations, the more intense their populist sentiments are. Correspondingly, the model was designed to gauge the intensity of respondents' political populism, or putting it differently, the extent to which their populist frame is crystallized. And since vaccines are manufactured by transnational corporations and are imposed on the population by governmental officials who communicate in unintelligible phrases and alienate people with their technocratic overlook, it is easy to interpret vaccination as a ploy to harm the people for profit or other unrecognizable reasons. Hence, the key hypothesis I tested. Vaccine-hesitant actors tend to harbor populist opinion. And here, the distinction between the demand and supply end approaches becomes relevant. Focusing on the supply end isolates belief-related components of populism, which is methodologically sound because I expected that intensified populist sentiments should correspond with more pronounced vaccine-hesitant opinions. So we have the same conceptual level here. I compared sentiments and beliefs. Now, a note on the design. My purpose was to study the differences in political beliefs of people representing the opposing camps of the vaccination debate. To do it, I crafted a questionnaire containing 3 blocks. The most essential contained questions to measure the intensity of populist sentiments. I will describe it in a minute. For the moment, let's focus on other sections. So, given the stigma often associated with populism, few respondents would sincerely answer, yes, I'm a populist. Therefore, while inviting people to participate, I did not refer to populism at all. I am aware that some could object to my approach as unethical. However, I think and I know that concealment of a study's purpose is permissible in social sciences if it brings no harm to respondents, and that was actually my case. Furthermore, collecting questionnaires via the internet is prone to self-selection bias. Had I openly declared that I was studying populism, the tendency to self-selection would have intensified, and only those who proudly accept the label of populist would be represented in my sample. So to address this issue, I advertised the questionnaire as a study of differences in political opinions, namely political opinions and differences between pro-vaccine and vaccine-hesitant Ukrainians. And in fact, the declaration was quite accurate because in addition to the key hypothesis, which I was working with, I was also eager to explore the broader range of the political sympathies of the members of the vaccine-hesitant community in Ukraine. And to do it, I used several methods to dive into the exploratory questions. For instance, conducting in-depth interviews, I probed into an array of topics: the annexation of Crimea, the decentralization reform, the new language reform, and other issues which were relevant at that particular period of time. Unfortunately, due to the war, I collected only a dozen of interviews, and this amount is not applicable to systemic research. So I used them only to show some lateral support to my findings. The questionnaire, however, helped to address the exploratory questions more systematically. It focused on respondents' views on three political questions: Euromaidan, Ukraine's European integration, and NATO. As shown by numerous researches, attitudes toward these three issues are, or we can put it mildly, used to be, before 2022, significant markers of identitarian boundaries in Ukraine. And besides, I expected these questions to yield different answers from people with and without political beliefs because, as other cases within the European Union suggest, populists usually distrust and perceive large bureaucratic institutions and tend to nurture Euro hesitancy and isolationism. So as you can see on the slide, that was a part of my assumption regarding the exploratory question. And by the end of the questionnaire, respondents found a question prompting them to indicate their disposition in the vaccine debate. Essentially, it did not ask respondents about their behavior. So I did not ask them, have you got a shot? Instead, respondents were encouraged to choose between two mutually exclusive options. Yes, vaccines have too many side effects, or no, vaccines are the best protection against the disease. And after such a self-categorization act, two classes, vaccine hesitant and pro-vaccine, populated my sample. The former, vaccine hesitant, they constituted a treatment group. I expected them to harbor vaccine hesitant beliefs because of more intense populist feeling. And the pro-vaccine group, it naturally constituted or served as a control group. Let's go further. Finally, to measure the intensity of populist sentiments, I used 16 questions designed as the 5-point Likert scale so that respondents indicated how strongly they concurred with each statement. The first 8 statements, they are in blue on the slide you are seeing, they measure populism per se. A stronger yes means a more robust populist frame. The theses themselves, they focused on 3 essential characteristics of populism captured in the working definition I have just discussed. First, assertion of the moral antagonism between the people and the elites. Second, rejection of political pluralism. And third, request for the performative expression of law style in political process. And for this reason, you can see those 3 columns on the slide. Other 8 questions, they are in red on the slide, they served as conceptual controls because each question, it measured the magnitude of elitist or pluralist attitudes. Both, I mean elitist and pluralist worldviews are conceptualized in the scholarly literature as alternatives to populism. Thus, when respondents score high on pluralist or elitist scales, this offered lateral evidence that they do not use a populist frame. So just to recapture, here is the model I used and its principal assumptions. I studied vaccine hesitancy as a belief. Conceptually, I used the idea of mutually exclusive triad of populism, elitism, and pluralism. I tried to focus on 3 dimensions of populism, and I considered populism as a scale with more or less intensive variations, and the idea to check on respondents' position on the scale was concealed from the respondents who participated, from the participants. Now, let's move to the results because I think it is something that we are most interested in. Here are some important highlights. First, the completion rate was reasonably high. although some participants, they complained that questions were a little bit weird and not what we are expected. I think this suggests that my little ruse not to advertise the focus on populism actually worked well. So people came there to for a study on their political opinions, and there were not only questions on their political opinions and some weird questions. They answered them anyway. As you can see, the completion rate is rather high. The accumulation rate was also quite reasonable. 200 respondents completed it on the very first day, and circa 10 respondents completed the form every day for 3 weeks after I launched the project. The data, however, have 2 limitations. First, initially I hoped to have 500 respondents in the treatment group and 500 respondents in the control group. But after some time of data collection, it was plain that the treatment group was exceeded by the control group. So to countermand, I deliberately started asking participants of anti-vaccination mass rallies and people who granted me in-depth interviews to share the questionnaire in their circles, which they did. And it gave positive results. But because I adopted this strategy in early February, the war actually halted the process. So it is the first limitation of the data. Control group and treatment group are not equal, although I hope to have them this way. Second, as any survey distributed via the internet, my survey also suffers from the self-selection bias. And some indicators of this bias, you can see them on the slide. You see the number of atheists is quite high as compared to the Ukrainians in general. Number of females is higher. But I think the most remarkable indicator of the self-selection bias is captured here on the graph on respondents' income status. As you can see, the questionnaire was filled by the members of the relatively affluent middle classes. So it is something I was pretty aware of. And in this slide, I interpret the results. The survey sample shows not intense populist beliefs. The respondents neither demonize political elites nor idealize the people or expect politicians to exhibit popular cultural features. Moreover, consistent with the assumptions, there are notable elitist and pluralist tendencies proper to the respondents. Politicians are expected to guide the masses, not to follow them. And during the period of crisis, respondents believe that it is sensible to limit the people's influence over the political process. And likewise, respondents support and not fear minority rights. So what can we see in those general results? We see middle classes values with pluralists and elitists biases, which I attribute to their upbringing, status, and internalization of the dominant liberal discourse. Notably, these middle class members nurture some populist sentiments only when assessing the political performance of the authorities or when contemplating the inflated political influence of the oligarchs whom they, I mean the respondents, consider an interest group, alien, and very different from other citizens. And I think there is an explanation why the populist framework activates only in this case. The middle classes tend to view themselves as true representatives of the people. Their sociological disposition corresponds to what the neo-Weberian theory calls the double closure. On the one hand, they envy the predominant role of the ultra-rich, who ostensibly twist policies for their interests. But on the other hand, the middle classes, they fear the possible ascendance of the underclasses, which would undermine their status. Hence, a typical mixture of elitism and pluralism with populist sentiments focused only on the upper crust. Okay. So once again, let's be very sincere about this. I tapped into the middle classes milieu. Because if vaccine hesitant respondents from the middle classes display a higher level of populism, the causal link between the independent and dependent variable must still be there. So I disaggregated the responses controlling for vaccine hesitancy, and you can see the results on the chart. On 6 out of 8 scales that measure populist beliefs, vaccine hesitators scored higher. The rise in the expectations that the people of them, the condemnation of political compromises are especially indicative. In addition, there is a growing belief that special interest groups, which might mean either minorities or elites, or even both, so those special interest groups excessively influence political decisions. And also important is the transition from rejection to a neutral attitude concerning the statement that politicians should follow folk socio-cultural patterns. Let me remind you that according to the model's assumption, transition from rather not to unsure means a +1 increase along this scale. Other results, they are also noteworthy. Let me turn on the light just. So in their negative evaluation of the political class and the perception of a chasm between the people and the elites, pro-vaccine respondents and vaccine hesitators, they don't diverge. And I interpret these as indicators of belonging to the middle classes. So given the boost across the measurements of populist sentiments, my next step was to conduct a number of classical hypothesis tests. In particular, I conducted T and Z tests and found that the increment in populist sentiments is not random and statistically significant. My next step was to make another logical check. No, before that, another important point. So the differences according to the statistical tests was the most pronounced for POP3, POP6, and POP8 scales. You can see them on the slides. They correspond respectively with the moral antagonism between the people and the elites, anti-pluralism, and socio-cultural performative expectations. Therefore, my model managed to capture the tripartite nature of populism successfully. On the other hand, they showed less robust results, and in fact, only half of them passed T and Z tests. However, taken together, the results, they suggest that I have established a set of scales that, when combined, predicted respondents' likelihood of belonging to the vaccine hesitant camp. Now to another next logical step. But before, let me spell out the results. It's like essential. A person who doubts representative institutions and who believes that ordinary people should be granted a role in the articulation of communal political interests. A person who does not believe in the expediency and acceptability of political compromises. A person who expects politicians to speak and dress like ordinary people. A person who worries that minorities in democratic systems can easily impose their will on the general public. A person who rejects the principle of democratic rotation and seeks the total domination of his or her political forces, and a person who opposes the minimization of the influences of ordinary citizens on political decisions under any circumstances. Such a person is not just a citizen with enhanced populist expectations, but also a person with a greater probability to question vaccination. Conclusion. Then the next logical step was to check whether other factors were not the real cause of the ties observed between populism and vaccine hesitancy. For this purpose, I used the chi-square, another classical strategy, to check the association level between the control variables and the magnitude of populist sentiments. The results show that high income or good education or all the other control variables you can see, they do not associate with pro pro-vaccine beliefs. And this is, by the way, is consistent with other national cases. In the United States, one of the highest rates of vaccine hesitancy is detected in well-educated Californian counties. And in New Zealand, the stronghold of vaccine hesitancy is affluent Auckland. So since control variables do not affect the results, I conclude that citizens who have negative attitudes towards the principles of liberal pluralism and who imagine politics as a sphere of eternal confrontation between corrupt elites and good people, in other words, populists by convention, those citizens are likely to question vaccination policies. So having established the causal relationship between populism and vaccine hesitancy, I tried to measure its strengths. For this purpose, I ran the binary logistic regression. And although t-tests suggests that 6 scales of the questionnaire, POP3, POP6, POP8, pluralism 3, pluralism 4, and elitism 4. So those 6 scales were suggested as the best predictors that respondents should be skeptical about vaccines. While running the regression, I started with a typical step. I ran regression analysis with all variables, and then later I was gradually removing the least statistically significant ones to obtain a more robust model, the one you can see on the slide. So as the regression results suggest, there are greater odds that respondents who, first, fear that minorities could easily impose their interests upon the majority. Second, consider politics as a domain of uncompromising opposition between good and evil. Third, do not believe in the representative role of institutions. And four, consider politics as a zero-sum game. Those respondents tend to question vaccination. Numerically, if respondent A says, I don't know whether my political interest would be better represented by another citizen, whereas respondent B indicates rather yes, that is, there is a +1 intensification on the scale of populist beliefs, the odds that the respondent B questions vaccination increases by about 16%. Conversely, suppose respondent C, who imagines democracy as a regime that requires rotation of power and accepts possible electoral victories for his political opponents. Such pluralist orientation reduces his chances of being a vaccine hesitator by about 23%. And most essentially, the outcomes are incremental. So they add together for more robust result. In addition, a correlation analysis sheds some additional light on the patterns. As it turned out, respondents who reject institutional representation also tend to condemn political compromises and foster a more intense demand for socio-cultural representation of the people. And the apprehension that minorities could impose their interests on the agenda is growing along with the distrust in political compromises. And these associations, they actually make sense. A person who believes that democratic design is too vulnerable to the pernicious influence of small pressure groups, that person expects that good politicians should have clear visual markers of their pro-popular disposition. So they have to reveal themselves, to advertise themselves through language, clothing, culinary preferences, and household habits, because it's a way to identify good politicians and distinguish them from bad, like those who sold to the minority interests. So all in all, the results confirm my key hypothesis about causal relations between populism and vaccine hesitancy. However, an important caveat is required. The pseudo R-square of the model, as you can see on the slide, is relatively small. This indicates that other factors, apart from populism, are responsible for variations in vaccine hesitancy. However, this does not disqualify my conclusions because vaccine hesitancy is a complex, multi-causal belief. In-depth interviews, they actually corroborated this conclusion, revealing different pathways from motherly care to libertarian ethos, which led respondents to vaccine hesitancy. So to summarize, although vaccine hesitancy cannot be attributed solely to the intensity of populist sentiments, populism undoubtedly pushes people closer toward vaccine hesitancy. I would argue that the data argue that rather clearly. Another point to discuss, the exploratory questions, which I think might be of interest for you. Exploratory question results are more nuanced. In general, the respondents, being the members of the middle classes, support European integration, cooperation with NATO, and they positively evaluate the effects of Euromaidan. In fact, as you can see on the slide, vaccine hesitant people tend to be only slightly less enthusiastic in their views. So in other words, my assumption that populism should move vaccine hesitant respondents to illiberal ideals, that assumption proved to be wrong. And there are some additional points, some additional evidence that political opinions between the treatment and the control groups don't vary. First, anti-vaccination civil organizations, they do not seek to establish ties with any political party, as of now in Ukraine. Second, in-depth interviews proved that respondents held very different political affiliations. There were nationalists and leftists. There were people with conservative and liberal views. So they have no common denominator regarding their political opinions apart from populist sentiments. And third, the political choices of the figureheads of the anti-vaccination movement indicate a vital tendency. And to examine this tendency, let's focus on actors I have mentioned in the introduction. Please observe this part of the slide. So even a cursory glance at the political trajectories of Stakhiv and Stremousov reveals wild ideological swings as both lurched from radical left to far right. Moreover, ideological changes, they resonated significantly with the relative salience of the beliefs in question during a given period. For instance, anti-fracking movement became prominent in the mid-2010s, which attracted Stremousov. Anti-corruption agenda was very salient during the last years of Poroshenko's presidency, and Stakhiv joined the band. And neither had any sympathy for vaccine hesitancy before the COVID-19 crisis. So in other words, these personages are political entrepreneurs keen on accumulating media attention and gaining political capital. They are not true believers in vaccine deficiency. Moreover, their ideational opportunism shares another critical feature. In 2014, during the high tide of Euromaidan, Stremousov established a civic organization for President Yanukovych. In 2016, he was implicated in the Yuri Kleinos case, who attempted to push for a pro-Russian secessionist movement in Rivne. Similarly, Stakhiv cultivates ties with anti-Western forces in Ukraine, like Viktor Medvedchuk, and less known regional politicians with equally pro-Russian tendencies. To describe the political trajectories of Stremousov, Stakhiv, and the like with a succinct phrase, the following sentence suffices. They are intent on stirring troubles and weaponizing whatever discontent. And since Russia is the actor most comprehensively playing the destabilization card in Ukraine, since Russia is channeling money and other resources in this endeavor, unscrupulous political entrepreneurs gravitated toward Russia and played the tunes it found useful. For this reason, during the COVID pandemic, opportunists peddled anti-vaccine agenda. However, the fact that political operators purposefully use vaccine hesitancy to destabilize a democracy does not necessarily mean that vaccine hesitancy per se poses a threat. Likewise, those entrepreneurs' attempts to politicize the vaccine hesitancy community does not guarantee their success. And given the lack of anti-liberal sentiments in my sample in the treatment group, I would argue that the data suggest that, unlike cases in Pakistan, India, or Italy, vaccine hesitancy in Ukraine remains a social movement without clear political agenda. In other words, I tend to treat the threat it poses to democracy as quite negligible. And just like finishing the presentation, and I think we are going to have some discussion, I want to give you another important caveat. While analyzing the questionnaire, I also ran a linear logistic regression to see whether populism itself is responsible for particular political opinions. And it turned out that respondents do tend to be more critical of Euromaidan when they first believe in direct popular sovereignty, second, blame officials for inefficiency, and third, are apprehensive about political minorities' influence. Besides, populists interpret Euromaidan as a failed attempt by the people, an attempt tamed and abused by political elites. In a similar vein, while evaluating the effectiveness of the European integration, respondents assesses it more favorably if they, first, believe in the robustness of representative institutions, second, profess the liberal ideals of pluralistic state policy, and third, they are convinced that political leaders, not the common folk, should set the political agenda. In other words, European integration is favorably evaluated by pluralists and elitists, while the populists, they remain wary. And the same results were seen for the question about NATO. So to conclude, both qualitative and quantitative analysis indicate that the intensity of populist beliefs harbored by an individual is one of the factors behind his or her tendency to distrust vaccination. Moreover, other possible factors, such as religious beliefs or income level, do not affect the propensity for vaccine hesitancy. At the same time, the populism apart, vaccine hesitators do not share any political opinions, including an antagonistic stance toward the European integration or rejection of Ukrainian statehood. In other words, the vaccine hesitancy movement in Ukraine remains a manifestation of collective distrust of political elites, minorities, and transnational actors, rather than a politically organized form of pursuing clearly defined interests. And conceptualizing the link between the populism and vaccine hesitancy, I interpret it as follows. In any society, there are individuals convinced that under a democratic regime, certain selfish minorities, such as pharmaceutical corporations or anti-natalists, they can easily impose policies that are beneficial to themselves, but detrimental to the people. And such individuals, individuals with those opinions, they try to resist the behind-the-scene dealings in two ways. First, they yearn for a genuine people's tribune, a politician who will resolutely represent the people through policies, words, and actions. Hence, the request for populist performative action. And second, these people, they resort to both open and covert sabotage of policies advanced by sinister interest groups. And as such, vaccine hesitancy is a contemporary manifestation of what the anthropologist James Scott calls the weapons of the weak. He defines it as the everyday resistance of socially weak players to the norms and rules imposed by dominant actors. And it is essential that weak, they rarely pose a political threat to the established order, the political order, because they prefer to focus on alleviating their day-to-day lot. A genuinely menacing scenario is when dissident political entrepreneurs tap into this reservoir and mobilize it for their purpose. In this respect, Stahib and the like are to be constantly monitored. However, given that the ongoing war makes the vaccine debate less stringent, opportunists, they are likely to ignore the vaccine hesitancy movement henceforth. Recently, they started doing just that. Alexei Oskar, an erstwhile partner of Stahib from the anti-vaccination camp, he shifted gears, stylized himself as a volunteer, and started criticizing the Ukrainian government for inadequate military supplies. So he lost his interests in the entire vaccination movement. I think this is bound to happen with all of them. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Gomza, for that very interesting presentation. So now we're going to turn to the Q&A. Catherine, is the Q&A through the chat? Is that the way you do it?
I think that's how we'll do it today. So, but I think we can give people the ability to unmute themselves if they have a question at this point as well. So either through the chat or if you want to raise your hand and ask.
Okay, so as the questioners prepare their questions, I have a couple I'll start off with. So Ukraine has a particularly low COVID vaccination rate. I believe it's the lowest in Europe, and has traditionally been hesitant to all kinds of vaccines, not just COVID-19 vaccines. So I wonder which vaccines were available in Ukraine for COVID-19. If you think that the origin of the vaccines is significant in any way in terms of people's willingness to take the vaccine or not. Because personally, I've done some research on different vaccine availability, for example, Russian and Chinese vaccine availability, and how that affects people's willingness to take a vaccine. So I'm curious about the Ukraine situation.
Well, it's an excellent question. And as a person who got 3 shots against the COVID, I can actually name those I used and actually make some generalizations. So first of all, Sputnik was not available in Ukraine. It was a political decision not to use it. And I can say it was sensible from a medical point of view, because we know that Sputnik is not that effective. So CoronaVac, Pfizer, Moderna, and the last one is eluding my name. They all European and Western-made vaccines were available in Ukraine. They were purchased by the WHO as some government-to-government relations. And actually, anyone who wanted to have a shot, he or she could do it easily. Just giving you a generalization, at some point of time, when people who actually wanted to have it, they saw that they have a chance to actually choose. It was like, I don't want to have Pfizer. I'd rather take Moderna because, and then there were any kind of rationalization. But all in all, those vaccines, the vaccines used here were the vaccines used in France and in Great Britain. So, like, I would say the better part of the vaccine available at the international market.
So that strengthens your argument about the possible correlation of views regarding membership in the European community and so on, with the attitudes towards vaccine hesitancy and so on. So that's an interesting finding. My other question has to do with the government's response to hesitancy, because Ukraine had a very low vaccination rate. So how did the government respond to this? What kind of steps did they take to encourage, or did they take steps to encourage vaccination or to reduce disinformation about vaccines?
Well, actually, typical strategies have been adopted. And when I say typical, I mean the Ukrainian government did just what, let's say, Italian or French government did. First of all, it was quasi-mandatory, which means the access to public places was prohibited to people who don't get shot. And just to give you an example how it really impacted their day-to-day life, I had an interview with my respondent for in-depth interview about the vaccination. And naturally, she didn't have a shot. So we went to a cafe, and the first thing we were asked about is, please show us your anti-COVID vaccination certificate. And it was like, okay, I have it. She doesn't. So we actually had to leave the place and sit in the street and have our conversation almost under the rain. So technically, yeah, people who did not got vaccination, they actually had their options how to penetrate the public space limited. But on the other hand, just to give you another example, I remember during the high tide of the COVID pandemic, I had to go to Odessa. So I took my certificate and I approached a person who lets you in a train. And I said, well, I have my certificate, what else? And she told me, well, I don't care. In Odessa, we don't care about COVID. We don't have it there. You have it in Kyiv. I was, wow, okay. So there are a plethora of attitudes. And, even if the government tried to impose, the access to trains with certificates, the street level bureaucrats, sometimes they just sabotage it because of their own beliefs.
There are also fake vaccine certificates, I understand, as in many countries.
Well, yes, it is an issue in Ukraine as well, but I don't have statistics to say whether it is so huge or not so huge. But yeah, I have some acquaintances who actually, boasted that they have the fake certificate. So it happens as well.
Yeah. Okay, so let's turn to the audience. I believe Henry Hale has a question.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Yvonne. Yeah, this is really terrific research. I think it's careful, interesting. So I just have a couple questions. I guess one is, some research that I've seen on vaccine hesitancy in at least the United States actually links it to certain fundamental basic personality types and certain personality traits that, I haven't seen people really make this connection in scholarship, but it's occurred to me that maybe, there's some underlying personality trait that makes people vaccine hesitant that also could be linked to populism. And so, somehow the link may be going through personality traits. Just so I wonder about your thoughts on that. And then if I could, just the other question is, I wonder, to what extent, do you think that you would have found this pre-COVID, right? Like in 2019, or is this, and it partly gets to the question of, is this really about vaccine hesitancy kind of consistently, generally over time, or really about what happened in the COVID era when states were front and center, in a highly salient manner, pushing vaccines. They were politicized in a lot of ways, right? Because you had Russia with its vaccine diplomacy, and the first vaccines that came to Ukraine were from the West, the major ones. So I wonder, to what extent you think this is something specific to the COVID era and aspects related to that. I know these push it a little beyond the paper itself, which I think actually very solid. So there's just interesting questions that it sparked for me.
Well, thank you, Henry, for your questions. I'll start with the second one, because actually it was pretty clear from the questionnaire that what we are observing right now, it is caused by COVID. Because I had a special question, whether those people who indicated that they are vaccine hesitators, they had, a branching question, and there was, do you harbor doubts about the COVID vaccines or about vaccines in general? And the majority of the respondents, they indicated the former. So those were the people who had troubles with COVID vaccines. So we can say that the results we are observing here, they are provoked by that advent, maybe even the intrusion of the state in the day-to-day life of people. And I think it actually makes my conceptualization about the weapons of the weak more prominent, because it is something people who actually didn't care much about healthcare, a decision they had to make then and then. And COVID actually did it. So without COVID, I think the vaccine debate would not have been so stringent. Although I do agree with Professor Vishnik that in Ukraine, it is in order, because we have very low vaccination rate with measles and other preventable diseases. And now to your first question, it's really cool, because actually I remember a number of studies which indicated that personality traits are positively associated with populism. The name of one author is eluding me, but the results of his study are pretty obvious. So he showed that people, the big five of personal features. So people who have that low attractiveness level, so people who don't trust others, who don't think that interpersonal communication brings them good, those people, they tend to be populists. And I think that goes perfectly to my conclusions. It comes hand in glove, because Populists and low attractive people with low attractiveness, they also tend to be not very sociable, and vaccination is very often comprised as a pro-social act. So I would think that that part of populist theory also corroborates my results.
We have another question from Antonina Berezovenko.
Yeah, hello. I have a brief question on the language reform you have mentioned. What was that about, and what is the corresponding legislation of that reform?
Well, the point is that around the 2020, there was a new phase of the language reform when Ukrainian language was made more mandatory in public sphere. And it was like, another exploratory question. Maybe, just maybe, people who are vaccine hesitators, they tend, to oppose that move, or as any exploratory question, maybe they espouse it more robustly. And as I told it, I didn't put it in the questionnaire, but during the interviews, it was pretty obvious that people have very different opinions on that. So no relations to the mandatory use of Ukrainian language in public sphere and media with vaccine hesitation was detected.
Thanks.
Any other questions from the audience? Well, I have a question about the regional spread of your study. I don't remember if you mentioned if the respondents were in a particular area. Because I wonder if there are regional differences about vaccine hesitancy, and also if the war has had any measurable impact, do you think, on people's tendency to be populist and or reject vaccines?
So let's start with the war. The war freezed the data collection. I mean, all the data was collected. Literally, the latest response was in February 22. After the war, I actually reopened the questionnaire to check whether some other people fill it in. No, 0 responses after the war, which makes sense. I mean, come on, people were thinking about something else. So no effect of war was recorded in the study. However, about the regional dimension, it's a very solid and correct question. And I tried to cover Ukraine in general. And since I used the ProQuest platform to collect the responses, it actually had a tracking point, which showed me the region people respondents come from, and Kyiv, Lviv, Poltava, so all Ukraine. I am not claiming that I have some, equal regional distribution, but the results are taken from Ukraine in general. And moreover, the in-depth interviews, they were taken in Odessa, Kyiv, and Lviv. So kind of, but once again, I don't want, to overemphasize it, because the amount of the interviews was quite negligible. I mean, 12 of them. So we cannot make big conclusions out of that.
We're at time, Catherine. Do we have a time to answer a few more questions, or?
Dr. Gomza, is it okay with you if we continue for 5 more
Absolutely.
minutes?
I have, let's say, 15, 20 more minutes. So if people are eager to...
Okay, I see three more questions here. One was a follow-on to Henry's in the chat, asking whether or not there's a kind of way of thinking that would contribute to populist beliefs, and if there's a way that you measured that in any way, that with some kind of precursor to populist beliefs that would contribute to vaccine hesitancy.
Well, I would argue that the way of thinking is actually something about the populism per se. As you can see, I used very consciously the phrase the populist sentiments, the populist beliefs. So populism is a way of thinking, the way how people conceptualize their relations to the political and socio-cultural realities. Elites are bad, the people are good. On the other hand, what I put into the questionnaire as control variables was religion, degree of education. And moreover, I even asked the participants to indicate what kind of education they received. Something like, I had a degree in engineering, or I had a degree in biology, because I was thinking that maybe people who had a science degree, they are more positively, they have more positive attitudes toward, vaccinations, because they understand the mechanism. Whereas the people, for instance, in literature studies, they know next to nothing about that, so they might have some reservations. So no, it is not true. People with different degrees are equally represented in both pro and control and treatment group, and there is no correlation between the type of education, I mean science versus humanitarian, and their belongingness to the camp. So it brings me back to the question, what other way of thinking can we code in? It's a good question, and other people, they might come with their ideas, for instance, if it is not religion and if it is not gender, because it was also, something like mothers, they have to care about children in Ukraine more often than dads. So maybe they are faced with that decision, to vaccinate or not vaccinate my baby, and maybe it pushes them to any extreme. It also doesn't help. So once again, what are other ways of thinking can be coded in? If you have those ideas, you are welcome to share. I really mean it, and we can test them.
Your comment about upper income Californians and vaccine hesitancy, I think it falls into that category of a certain way of thinking of certain people. So moving on to Tatiana Kozhakari, who has a question.
Hello, good evening. Thank you so much, Ivan, for your presentation. I have just a short question. I'm wondering if you noticed during your research a correlation between vaccine hesitant group and religion preference. I mean, religion identification more. Maybe like some people are going to Orthodox Russian church, maybe others to Ukrainian church, and so on. Thank you so much.
So yes, it was like another usual suspect. So I put not only religion, but also the denomination, the church you follow as a control variable. And once again, no association was observed, which might actually suggest that my sample was too little. Because don't forget, I have 30% of atheists, which is much more higher in the sample than in Ukraine in general. So maybe should I have been able, to collect 5,000 respondents, then some relations would be more obvious. But in my sample, whether people were Muslim or Ukrainian Orthodox Church or any other church, it had no relations with their populist beliefs and their anti-vaccination preferences.
Okay, thank you so much.
Our last question is from Sergei Pahomenko.
Thank you, Ivan, for your presentation. And I have a following question. According to some surveys, certain part of Ukrainian vaccine hesitator was inspired by Belarusian experience. I would like to remind you that firstly, Belarusian dictator Lukashenko said that there are not COVID in Belarus, and this correlated with sympathy of their part of Ukrainian society, sympathy to Belarusian politics and personally to dictator Lukashenko. Have you studied external factor, for instance, Belarusian influence Ukrainian vaccine hesitator moods?
Well, Sergei, thank you for your question. I would say that although the emulation and transnational emulation is very important to properly understand any social movement, it comes too much outside the theoretical framework of my research. I mean, my causal link was between populism and vaccine hesitancy. To add transnational influence, it was like putting a layer of complexity over a layer of complexity. And moreover, as I put it, since I noticed no consistency in political opinions other than populism, I would argue that only a fraction of people might have been influenced by their sympathies to Lukashenko. Among vaccine hesitators, there are many very ardent Ukrainians and Ukrainian nationalists as well, which have little regard to Lukashenko.
Thank you. So unless there are other questions, I think we can thank Professor Gomza for his very interesting presentation about his survey, and wish him well and as to further extend his research and in the future. And thank Catherine Donovan for organizing this very interesting event.
Thank you very much for your attention and take care.